Welcome, everyone, to the PFA, People for the American Way conversation about the George Floyd verdict, and also how America can move forward post the decision to convict Officer Chavin for the crimes he committed during the George Floyd case. My name is Diallo Brooks. I am the Senior Director of Field Mobilization for People for the American Way. And I'm joined by a very, very esteemed panel to discuss these very, very important topics, very timely topics, and move forward a conversation about how we move America forward. People for the American Way has been front and center in this conversation and many other conversations about protecting our democracy. And we will continue that fight and be front and center in that fight as we move forward. We will hear some opening remarks from our esteemed president, Ben Jealous, who is joining us by car. So he's really a man of the people, and we're excited to have him as a part of this conversation. And we're also joined by Dr. Mary Frances Berry, who is a board member of ours and also a longtime civil rights advocate. Been front and center in many of these fights over the years, and she's going to bring some tremendous remarks here as well. We also have with us Savante Myrick, who is the mayor of Ithaca, New York, who's doing some amazing work in Ithaca that we'll hear about as well. And later on in the program, we'll also be joined by Rana Epting from Move On. And Move On has been a key partner of ours in working to mobilize communities around important issues. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our fearless leader, our esteemed president of People for the American Way, Ben Jealous.
Thank you, Diallo, and thank you everybody for joining. And, you know, we all breathed a collective sigh of relief yesterday. So except we had accountability, we still don't have justice. Justice really requires that we create a country where not only George Floyd's joining and where not only George Floyd's murderer can be held accountable, but where his daughter, where George Floyd's daughter can grow up assured that she will be afforded the safety that her father was not. As a Black parent, grew up with a grandfather who drove 10 miles under the speed limit in Anne Arundel County, where I live, Maryland, every time we left Baltimore City, because he was a member of law enforcement and yet was afraid of law enforcement. And my son, who's 8 years old, you know, we had a day where literally he had read 200 pages, he had done 200 lines of kind of simple coding, and we sat down to have dinner and have a conversation, celebrate. And all he wanted to ask me was why so many Black people get killed by the police. Like so many little Black boys, he had grown up wanting to be a police officer like at 5, 6, 7. And by 8, it was just, it was around the time George Floyd was killed. And so what do we do now? Well, we have to pass federal reforms. We've got to get Kristen Clark through. There's a reason why the Republicans are trying to hold up Biden's appointments, Vanita Gupta, Kristen Clark, because when you are leading an assault on voting rights, when you are leading an assault on an effort to stop serious reform of our public safety systems, the last thing you want is a fully empowered Department of Justice staffed by civil rights lawyers like Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark. We also have to recognize that one of the peculiarities of our democracy is that we have 13,000 law enforcement agencies that all have their own rules, their own systems for training, their own use of force standards even can vary widely. We're not like other countries where they can change public safety from the top down and have it be nationwide overnight. No, we have to change it from the bottom up, as President Obama reminded us last summer. And when you look at that, it can be overwhelming. It can seem daunting. But then you consider the fact that Black people in America, you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, Black people in America are clustered into predominantly 25 metro areas. Over half of Black America lives in just 25 metro areas, about 100 counties of the more than 10,000 counties in the United States. 80%, over 80% live in 100 metro areas, 500 counties of the more than 10,000 counties across the United States, well over 10,000 counties across the US. It starts to become more achievable because even in states like Mississippi, we progressives, people of color, control those counties. We control Hinds County, Mississippi, where Jackson is, for instance. And so there's reason to be hopeful that we can, if we stay in movement mode, if we stay engaged, help transform our country both from the top down. We're trying to push through legislation this next kind of remaining year and a half, if you will, the first half of the Biden administration, and also from the bottom up. And that the places that where we can have the biggest impact numerically on the country, both in covering the biggest number of Americans and of Black people whose lives are so vulnerable, are the places that we tend to be strongest. And so today we're going to have a robust conversation. Mary Frances Berry, head of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, is going to talk to us about sort of what we can do at the top, the federal changes. Mayor Savante Myrick is really going to talk to us about what we can do at the local level. On day 3 of the trial, as you'll hear, they push through the boldest vision for public safety reform we've ever seen in this country in a little college town of Ithaca, New York. And then we'll hear from Rana at Move On about what we should be doing as activists. So buckle your seatbelts. It should be a great conversation.
I can't hear you, Diallo. You're muted, Diallo.
With that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Mary Frances Berry to give us some remarks as well.
All right. Well, that was a very exciting opening, Ben. And so all I can say is that having Chauvin convicted yesterday was not, in my view, a time for real celebration. And that's because there's so much work that has to be done. Ben talked about some of it. Part of it is it's been a year since the George Floyd Policing Act was passed by the House, been almost a year, and it hasn't passed yet in the Senate. And so we don't have the act yet. We, in fact, have the sentencing yet to come for George Chauvin, and we don't know how that's going to turn out since the judge opined from the bench to the defense that he thought that they had a very good ground for appeal, which was a little bit irritating. So we'll have to worry about that. And we also have other police officers who were there and who were part of they were accessories in aiding and abetting what happened to George Floyd, and were captured on video. Their cases are coming up, so we have to figure out a hope that something positive will come there. In the meanwhile, we have in the Policing Act, it's not perfect, but it needs to be passed. And it's not perfect for the reasons that Ben gave. It has provisions to not give all of this military weaponry from the Defense Department to police departments around the country who are militarized to the teeth in some of the places. It has provisions in it to outlaw racial profiling, which we've been trying to get rid of for years. And it has provisions in it to modify the immunity of police officers who can't get sued civilly when they engage in this use of force and the kind of thing that killed George Floyd and these other people who have been killed in the last few days, even one today. But in fact, there's a provision that would modify that somewhat, but not change it. And the problem there is some people say, well, we get, if somebody can sue and civil damages, get $27 million from the local people, or get $1 million, as in case, I guess, $1.5 million with Eric Garner, that at least they, got something. But the point is not to give them money. They would like to have their loved one back. That's number one. And number two, that doesn't really stop the police officer from engaging in the kind of activity that we want to outlaw. We've seen that the Justice Department says that in addition to us trying to get the Policing Act passed, that they have opened an investigation of the Minneapolis Department. It's very obvious from what we all saw on video that the Minneapolis Department and probably others have some training problems. If you saw that young police officer who was a newbie, who had come more recently from the academy, who was the guy who walked up to Floyd when he was sitting on the driver's side in the car and took his gun out when he first approached him, when it was only a controversy about a $20 bill that allegedly or may have been or counterfeit or wasn't clear. So we know that it's not just guys who've been around like Chauvin, but even some of the new people need to have a better training. And so we have, and the data registry, that's really important in the George Floyd bill, that for the first time, police departments would have to report encounters with people like traffic stops and other things so that we can get a picture of what's happening. And also when an officer is charged or there's a complaint that they have misbehaved and used force in ways, it would be part of the report. And the way the federal government does that in that bill is the way it does everything else, is to say we'll cut off the grants or funds that we get from you if you don't do these things, because we have no authority, as been said here in this country, to issue top-down orders from local police departments, to local police departments. And then the last thing is the Justice Department talks about consent decrees now. We had consent decrees used in some of the cities, including here in New Orleans, where I happen to be right now. And we are under a consent decree. And the result has been that a consent decree saying, go forth and don't sin anymore, and don't do any of these bad things anymore, may sound fine, but consent decrees are really not very useful. Everybody knows that. The main thing they do is that we pay lawyers a whole bunch of money, the taxpayers do, to come down and monitor and monitor and monitor and monitor, but it doesn't stop the activity. That is why we need something more robust. What we need that is more robust, there are two things that I would suggest. One is at the federal level, the government ought to use a resource that hasn't been mentioned at all in all of these discussions. It should use the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which I used to chair and was on for years, which did all kinds of investigations of whole police departments and gave the data, which is what's really important, to the Justice Department so that they could use it. And the key thing was that the Civil Rights Commission has subpoena power. It doesn't have to go to court to get a subpoena. It doesn't have to, it can subpoena. So I think that somehow they might look at that. And the second thing I would suggest, which I think Savandi is going to talk about, is that there are things that should happen at the local level. Some cities, Los Angeles and others, have made some changes in the way their police departments operate. But wherever you are, if you're listening, anybody within the sound of my voice, look to see what the local police department is doing. Are police officers in schools? When you went to school, I bet you there weren't any police officers in the schools. What are they doing there? And how are they behaving? And do they identify people and, get them into the system early, as I heard a police officer say one day to some kids on a playground? What are they doing? And how are they handling mental health issues and all the rest? Should you be reallocating the money that's in your department to different kinds of functions in a way that's more effective and where police officers can avoid these kind of encounters? And the really last thing is the police have to be involved. Your local police have to be involved in any local solutions, primarily because there are many people who live in communities who worry that there won't be any police and they worry about disorder and chaos, and they will stand in the way of any kind of reforms you want to make. So somehow you have to have buy-in from all of that. Now, the hope is that we won't have more of these murders taking place, which are happening even as we're talking about the great thing that happened in the case with George Floyd, and have been happening. And let us be relieved from these as we all work hard and move forward to try to solve these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Berry. Those were important points, and I think there's that federal response to policing is going to be very important as we move forward. But there's also some of the comments you made about the state and local level being a place that we can see reforms move to immediately is very important. And before I turn it over to Mayor Myrick, I want to remind folks that we are active in this fight. We're not going to be passive in the work that we're doing around reforming and changing and reimagining and reinvigorating our public safety systems. And we want you all to be a part of that fight with us. We hope that you all will check the chat. There is a link in the chat to be a part of the People For's public safety work. And I hope that you all will go into the chat, sign up. You'll get alerts. We'll keep you abreast of the fights that we're in. We'll give you opportunities over time to participate in the work that we're doing. And it's because of members like you all that we're able to do this work. And we need your voices in this fight in order for us to win. And with that, to talk about what's happening on the local level and also talk about an exciting initiative that Mayor Myrick is actually leading and has been leading and been a leader on, I want to turn it over to Savante Myrick, Mayor of Ithaca, New York.
Yeah, thank you, Diallo. And thank you to People for the American Way. Both the organization and the membership have been, for me, for all, 3.5 decades of my life, an inspiration and a champion to make America a better, safer, more progressive version of itself, which I really appreciate. And all of the three people, I'm just thrilled to share space with Ben Jealous and Dr. Berry and Diallo Brooks. We're all just tremendous leaders in this movement. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk about what we're doing in Ithaca, because I, like everybody else, a year ago, watched George Floyd be murdered and experienced what is now officially the largest civil protest movement, the largest civil uprisings in American history. Those were sparked by his murder, but were caused, the root causes, 400 years of oppression and inequality and unequal treatment under the law. And that requires accountability, which is what those 12 jurors delivered. Right? It required that the individual officer who committed this act be held accountable, but it also requires justice, which is a much larger ask, and it's on the rest of us. It's on the entire nation, not just those 12 people, to deliver, especially leaders at the local level. And I take that very seriously. I've often been myself frustrated with my elected officials, with people who represent me, who have thoughts and prayers when our system doesn't work, but don't have actual ideas, don't have things they are willing to try to fix the system. And this is a system that we just have to fix. So I'll tell you about what we're attempting to do in Ithaca, the journey that we've just set out on, and why. Because we've tried reform before, right? And I know that there are a lot of people, probably people on this stream, who have their entire life been involved in one reform movement after another, and have won important reforms in accountability and transparency, body-worn cameras, to having police officers' disciplinary records become publicly available. And those are important and more. For the last 9 months, the city of Ithaca has been engaged with our partner in Tompkins County in a deep dive and a real look inward. We engaged in very serious discussions with the Black community, with the Brown community, and with the most vulnerable members of our community, the LGBT community in Ithaca and the homeless population in Ithaca. We looked also at our data, compared ourselves to municipalities nationwide and also worldwide, and found that, look, we keep putting officers in these situations. And that is why bad, horrific, tragic outcomes happen, that a system is designed to get the outcomes that it gets. And we, for hundreds of years, have been getting the same outcome, nibbling around the edges of that system and expecting a different result. So the plan that we put forward and that our Common Council unanimously adopted last month would actually create a new department in lieu of the police department called a Department of Public Safety Community Solutions. It would include armed personnel, yes, but also unarmed personnel reporting to a new director, who could be a civilian background, with a new mandate, a mandate to actually build a public safety system that everybody in our community feels comfortable calling. And recognizing that not every human behavioral problem requires an armed, militarized response, that there are problems that we should be able to solve collectively. And yes, that means sending somebody who works for the government, but that has got to acknowledge that when we send armed personnel into every home, onto every stoop, into every street, we are triggering and traumatizing people who've had past negative experiences. And because of the advent of social media and cameras everywhere, that now includes every American. Every American has now had direct, visceral experience with killings and police violence, which means that we are triggering and raising the danger level for civilians and police officers alike. What else did we find out? We found out that the officers themselves are tired of it, right? That they know that, especially for the last 50 years, they've been called on to answer every human problem, whether it's a law enforcement problem or not. And that unless we turn the corner, unless we make a whole suite of changes, which is what we're proposing in our Reimagining Public Safety Plan, our Ithaca plan, that includes better screening for officers before they become on the force, better training for all of our workers in de-escalation and conflict resolution, unless we adopt new efficient tools, unless we use unarmed personnel to respond to things that are less likely to require arrests, much less the use of force, we are going to be getting the same unacceptable results. So I feel like we can do better. And in Ithaca, we have, by this unanimous vote 2 weeks ago, we have won ourselves the right to do more work, to design that department and implement it incrementally over the next 2 years, and showcase that you can build a public safety system that is different and better. One that has at the base of its culture, this is more than just a reset button, because even a reset implies that there was a point in the past where policing was working for everybody. We have to acknowledge that that point never existed in America, but it can. So we have to do more than a reset. We need a fresh start, a fresh beginning, a new system with a new culture. And if we don't do that, if local municipalities across the country, and if we in the city of Ithaca don't design a culture and a system from scratch, then we're going to be getting the same outcomes over and over again. Because as my incomparable HR director, Shelley Michelle Nunn, always reminds me, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And we can keep throwing different strategies at the problem of police violence, officer burnout, mistrust between the Black community and the police departments. We can keep throwing different strategies, but unless we build an entirely new culture, those strategies will get eaten up for breakfast.
Thanks, Avante. Just a reminder to folks in the chat, if you go to pfaw.org/public safety, you can sign up to join us in this fight. We are going to be organizing, we're going to be leading in this fight. And I just want to take a moment before we have our next speaker to just say that our work in this fight didn't begin yesterday. Day one, and actually before day one, when Ben Jealous became our president of our organization, he brought a group of us together and said, needs to be a central focus of our organization. In order to have a functioning and healthy democracy, we need to be doing what's necessary to end the level of police violence that we see in our communities around the country. And we've been doing that work moving forward. And so I just wanted to commend Ben for his leadership on this issue, because in order to create change, you have to have leadership. You can't just have hashtags and sit on the sideline. You have to have people that are willing to step up and do what's necessary to create real change. And with that, I'm excited to have Rana, who has joined us today, leading Move On, to really just talk about a little bit about organizing, how we got here, and also the importance of organizing around this work.
Thank you so much, Diallo, and it's wonderful to be with all of you here this afternoon. I'm Rana Epting with Move On, and we are a 1 million member organization. We have folks from all walks of life, multiracial, multiple ages, multiple politics in our coalition, and they live in every county of this country, and they take action when the moment calls for it. And many of our members have shown up to demand that Black Lives Matter, to demand that we invest in our communities and we disinvest in violent policing. And that wasn't always the case. I mean, if you think, gosh, time is eluding me, over 10 years ago, it was not common, everyday understanding that we have systemic racism, injustices, inequities in our policing system, that different communities experienced a different type of policing all throughout this country. And it is thanks to those organizers, those individuals, those activists, families that have suffered, that have taken action out of that suffering to make change that started years and years ago, that has resulted in the massive protests we saw all throughout last summer amidst a growing economic pandemic. People from all walks of life, people I never thought in a million years would say to me, wow, Black people really do have a different experience with American policing than I do. It did change hearts and minds, and that work to change hearts and minds starts with a seed of an individual taking action years and years ago. And if we recall, on the heels of the death of Trayvon Martin, the unjust killing of Trayvon Martin, this country was upset, but we didn't have the numbers in the streets that we had last summer. We didn't have the numbers in the streets that we even saw in Minneapolis recently. And it was a kernel of organizing that happened there. It was a family that was upset that they took action. And it was people that came together around that community and said, let's not let his death be in vain. Let's do something about it. And let's be clear, the verdict of Derek Chauvin yesterday, the fact that he was found guilty on all counts, that is accountability. And that, although it does not equate justice, it has resulted in a national conversation that, I don't know, 10 years ago, I couldn't imagine us having. And I think that this country is coming to a reckoning about the challenges we have and the enormity of the solutions that it's going to take to actually create a community, a society where everyone can feel safe, everyone can feel protected, where we take care of one another, and where it's not this competition of my safety has to come at the expense of yours. So I am grateful for every single person, from the person that spent 12 hours, 24 hours a day, every day, doing the organizing that got us here, to the people that came out for maybe the first time ever last summer to protest. It has shifted the hearts and minds, the beliefs of what justice needs to look like in this country for the better.
Thank you so much, Rana. I think those were really, really important points. And as we talk about organizing, as we talk about mobilizing, we really hope that folks will join the fight with us. There is a link in the chat. Please click on the link in the chat to join us and be a part of the conversation, be a part of the work that's necessary to create real change. Yesterday was accountability. Now we need to move forward to really realize justice. And with that, I want to turn it back over to our president, Ben Jealous, to talk a little bit more before we jump into some questions from the audience, to really talk a little bit more about how we move forward and what PFA's work, People for the American Way's work, will look like as we move forward.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you, Rana. And thank you, Mary Frances. Thank you, Mayor Myrick. Thank you, Diallo. You know, it's easy to get overwhelmed, and we have to recognize that that is probably the biggest threat here to our success, is us looking at the forest, if you will, and not understanding the only way to create a space for light is just to start cutting down individual uh, individual trees. And those trees, if you will, are, every single major metropolitan area across this country. If we can change county by county what the um, laws are that govern public safety in those areas, we can start to add up to really big change. And so we're asking you to sign up at pfaw.org/public safety to be in this fight for the next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years in your community. We organized over 3,000 Black faith leaders here. We organized 1,400 young elected officials. They all need activists to know who they are in their community so we can form teams of folks to get these laws passed. My grandma, old Southern farm girl, would say, yard by yard, life is hard. Inch by inch, life is a cinch. We keep focusing on the inches. One of those was Ithaca. Savante thought that his town would take 6 months to pass those reforms, but organizers got involved and they passed them in a few weeks, unanimously. Then we saw that the in cities like Camden, for instance, which sort of inspired some of the conversations around Ithaca. They said, we have a violent police department. It is a corrupt police department. It is oppressing Black people, and it is, frankly, tolerating a level of official corruption that even discourages real estate developers from coming into our city. And so what did they do? They created an entirely new police department. And that's what needs to happen in every single county, every single city across this country. People have to have the courage to reimagine what do we need in this moment, to recognize that the origin for public safety in our country is either the British colonial military, the redcoats that brought us the Boston Massacre, or it's slave patrols. That's where the inertia begins. That's where the culture begins. Culture, heard, eats policy for lunch every day. And so in order to put a period at the end of the sentence that has been this profoundly, not just racist approach to law enforcement, but authoritarian approach to law enforcement, we have to have the courage to admit that each one of our communities is going to have to reimagine public safety, put together a plan, and get it done. And one model is Camden, and another model is Ithaca. And we will be rolling out a toolkit that coalition of pastors, Black Lives Matter activists, criminologists, former law enforcement, a whole group of folks have been working on for a year to help your community do that. And that's why we're reaching out to you now to say, please sign up so that we can train you, we can get you plugged in, and we can go about transforming public safety in this country from the bottom up. And let me also say that that's going to be a lot easier than it feels like. Because true, we got to get to more than 10,000 law enforcement agencies across this country eventually. But if we just get to the 100 or so that make up the 25 metro areas where more than half of Black folks live, we will have achieved a lot. And let me also say this. Let's just recognize that we all have an interest in doing this. But between Philando Castile being killed in Minneapolis and George Floyd, a young white woman was killed by a Black officer. Why was she killed? Because she did not comply with his orders. He shot her through the windshield of her car. Why did she not comply? Because she was having an epileptic seizure. Black people, we are the canary in the coal mine for an authoritarian policing system that is ultimately a threat to all of us. And the brief history of recently in Minneapolis proves that. And so it should not be surprising, but it should give us a sense of hope that recent polls show that the majority, overwhelming majority of people in this country of all colors want to see public safety transform. So please sign up and let's get to work. This great ruling yesterday was a result of your activism, of Move On's activism, People Forward's activism, Black Lives Matter activists, NAACP activists, National Council of La Raza activists, across the country. Just great work. And it's also should just kind of recharge us to understand that we can do great things if we work together. So please go to pfaw.org/public safety and sign up so we can help form teams in your community to change public safety, not just from the top down, but from the bottom up. Diallo?
Hey, Diallo, may I say something?
Yes, you are always welcome to say something.
I wanted to tag on to what Ben said. In fact, if you sign up and if teams are developed and you start to work in your community, you will find that there are a few police officers who are so fed up with what's happening in their departments and so embarrassed by the other officers and so sickened by it that you may get some buy-in from people who will. So don't see it as just, all the police officers are going to resist us having any change and we've got to go and beat them over the head and get them to do it. There will be some people, just as there were some people who testified against Chauvin in the case from the police department in Minneapolis, under duress, of course, because of all the protests. But if you organize and if you manage it in your own community, you will find some police officers who will join in the call for reform, de-escalation and reform.
And that's critically important in order to move all of this work forward. It's going to take a coalition of folks. It's going to take a lot of will from all of us. It's going to take organizing to make all of this happen. And with that, I would like to solicit audience questions. If folks could put questions in the chat, and I will ask various speakers on this call to answer the questions. So the first one we have is, how can we hold police officers accountable for watching George Floyd being murdered? That's a great question. Anyone want to jump in on that one? Mary Frances, feel free to go ahead.
We've got these officers who were aiding and abetting and who were there, and we see them on the video, including the first one that went up to George Floyd, took his gun out, and the rest of them. In fact, they have trials coming up. They're being charged, and one way to do it is to keep up the momentum of insisting on a fair system there and hoping that we can get them convicted also for their behavior. I mean, for, when they knew that the guy had no pulse, remember that? Mm-hmm. And that indeed nobody did anything. They violated their duty to care and were aiding and abetting. So those trials, that's the first point there where they should be held accountable.
Great. Next question. How can police officers with 18 complaints against him, or a police officer with 18 complaints against him, continue to put people at risk? Like, how are we keeping these folks on the street? Go ahead, Ben.
One of the things we have to change is how we remove officers. We have to make it, frankly, easier to remove bad officers. Part of that ultimately comes down to changing the code of silence inside of these departments. The criminologists will tell you that roughly 10% of the officers in any given department are a problem. They're bad, they're abusive, they're corrupt. They generate the complaints. And then 10 or 15% have the courage to stand up to them. And there's that 70, 75% in the middle, 80% in the middle who are just silent. And that's the culture that's enforced by these police unions. And the way that you start to break that silence is, quite frankly, you make it easier to get rid of the bad officers so that 80% in the middle understands that there's going to be real consequences. Unfortunately, right now, it is harder to take away the license of somebody to be a police officer. When they kill somebody, then it's harder to do that than to take away somebody's medical license. And so we got to change that. I would also like to invite Savante to talk about how we prevent that on the front end by using psychological tests differently than most departments do when it comes to recruiting. Mayor?
Yeah, for sure. This is really important. I'll double down too on what Ben said. Much frustration with mayors and with local departments, and I don't think enough understanding of the protections that the police unions have won in the state legislatures over the years that make it nearly impossible to terminate or remove officers with it could be 18 complaints from their file, still impossible to fire them legally. But you can get ahead of this. And by going upstream, what we did in Ithaca 6, maybe 7 years ago now, was adding another layer to our typical job application. So you fill out the paper form, you complete the physical test, you pass through the job interview, and you're good to go, you're hired. But wait a minute, we added another layer that required psychological screening. And what we found is that psychological screening, when paired with a polygraph, a lie detector test, actually screened out a lot of the early warning signs for people, if given authority, will abuse that authority. And we ended up now, to date, we screen out about 75% of people who otherwise would have been hired. It's one of the reasons why the current officers we have on the job in Ithaca I have so much faith in is because we know that they've been through this extra screening and that they joined the profession for the right reasons. That should be a national standard.
And that's a reason why leadership is really important. And I think we've talked about this several times, having mayors that are willing to step up. And I think Savante stepping up and doing the work that he's doing will be really key to helping other elected officials, other mayors, other city council folks in cities around the country step up to really create real change. So the guilty verdict is just one step in the fight for justice for police. So what's next? And Ron, I'm going to invite you to answer that question.
Oh, so much. So this is a systemic problem. So one thing, as I was hearing some of the questions from folks coming in, is how can an officer have 18 infractions against them and still be a sitting officer? I mean, some of these are the questions that have wrecked all of our minds throughout this time. And the problem is that it's systemic. It's not just one officer. It's not just one police outfit. It's the entire system. And so there are many ways that you have to attack an entire system. And the most helpful thing is to ensure the demand is out there, it is public, it is palpable, it is undeniable. So continue to show up when there are protests in your community. That is super important because that's applying pressure on a system, and systems don't change by asking nicely. They change because there's a massive demand that won't go away, that continues to push. So that's one thing. And I'd say at the federal level, we have two pieces of legislation at the federal level, the Justice in Policing Act, and then we also have the Breathe Act. The Breathe Act has been endorsed and pushed by the movement for the broader Black Lives Matter movement, and the Justice in Policing Act has been pushed for a lot of the civil rights groups. Both are good and necessary. Some are more reforming and some are more transforming. And I think that movement forward is really, really important. And then at the local level, depending on your local community, there are different attempts at demands at changing the system. So in Minneapolis, you have the Yes on 4 campaign. It's a ballot measure. They'll really move from a policing system to a community care system. And there are lots of different communities that are trying on new models or pushing and advancing for new models. And what we should be looking for is trying new things, trying new ways of keeping our community safe. That's very important because we'll learn from those and they'll grow and they'll sprout. And so the original question, what's next, is continue to show up, engage in your local community, not just in these national efforts. Engage in your local community, go to your city council meetings, ask questions, join Color of Change, join NAACP, join People for the American Way, Move On. All of these organizations are equipping regular folks with tools that you can take in your local communities to advance change.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. And the organizing is going to be key. And one of the things that's really, really been stark about this movement is the diversity of folks that have shown up. It is not just one community that's shown up, it's a diverse community of folks that have shown up. And with that diversity, there's power. And so we need to do the hard work to exercise that power. We want folks to sign up. The link is in the chat to join us in this movement and join our partners as we push this forward. I'll take one more question before we begin to wrap up. So we have a question submitted. I live in the predominantly white state of Oregon. How do I get my small town bigger, louder, and more active? Anybody want to jump in on that? I know Savante is in a small town.
I'm offended. I'm offended. We are we're a small city. We've got thank you very much, and 37,000 of the smartest, best-looking constituents America could ever ask for, and I think it is a real challenge when it looks like it's other people suffering, when it looks like this is a problem that's happening to other people. It can be a challenge to motivate change and to break out of the status quo. But Ben's point is the right one, which is that white supremacist thinking is a threat to everybody, and that includes white people. And a public safety system that doesn't actually serve to keep us safer, that leads to mass incarceration, which makes us all poorer, that robs families of their potential, which means it robs, even if it's not your family that has a member incarcerated or placed in prison, it is that family's hard luck makes your life worse, right? Because that's a future surgeon that won't be able to help you when you're having a heart attack. That's a future teacher that won't be able to teach your kids, right? That's a future point guard for the New York Knicks. Lord knows we could use one that'll never be able to play. That we are all actually in this together. It is hard to do, but I will say that the hardest thing for me to do, and I'll thank the panel for not commenting more broadly on the point I'm about to make. But I was a nerdy child. I was very bookish and very quick to go to solutions. I like figuring out math problems and puzzles and putting together answers and saying, here. And when I first got on the city council in Ithaca 14 years ago, that is how I approached my job. I would come to the meeting having done a bunch of homework and showing my math and saying, here's the policy answer. Here it is, here it is, here it is. And what I really had to learn, which was something that was uncomfortable for me, was that to get other people engaged, to get them involved, you do have to share a bit more about yourself personally. And it wasn't until I talked about how often my father had been incarcerated, his struggles with substance abuse, my own childhood spent in a homeless shelter, that I was able to find and build common cause with other people who at first would come up to me after meetings or after town halls and whisper, look around and say, my uncle too, my mother also, my sister's struggling. And the same thing has happened with police harassment and police violence. So many of us have lived with the shame of being pulled over, knowing that we were going 15 miles over the speed limit, but also sensing that interaction was dehumanizing. And not knowing how to share it without inviting more harassment is a very scary and uncomfortable thing to do. But what I would encourage you to do, my experience has been that people won't care how much you know until they know why you care. And that to motivate your community, the best thing to do is to share your own story and then listen to theirs.
That's powerful, Savante. And Dr. Berry?
Yeah, I just wanted to tag onto that to say it is powerful, and I agree with everything that you said, Savanti, and I think thank you for sharing that. But to this question also, I've spent the last month commenting on international television, radio, all kinds of media all over the world through networks of various kinds on what happened in the trial as it has gone on the last 3 weeks. And it is a big story all over the world. And one of the things I got from places that I didn't imagine was, well, what's wrong with the United States? What are you guys doing over this? Doesn't make any sense. We saw the video too. Why are you even having a trial? What's going on? What happened to your democracy? We've heard all kinds of things about insurrection at the Capitol and this and that and Trumpism and whatever all this time. And now we find out that your police go around killing people by, getting down on the ground with them with a knee on the neck with other officers standing around watching. And you guys seem to have a hard time to do anything about this. And everything we hear is that it goes on all the time. Every time you look up, it's going on. What happened to your democracy? People keep asking, what does it mean to have a democracy in your country? So what does it mean to have a democracy in which we have a state like the predominantly white state of Oregon with small towns all over America? There are people who live in small towns and live in places. I have friends who live in Oregon. They happen to be white, well, they are white. But that doesn't mean that they don't see the videos and know what's happening. But the eyes of the world are on the United States in many ways. And there's no way we can be, what is that, the shining city on the hill, the beacon of whatever, when in fact you have this kind of information and it just keeps happening and happening and happening. So you and your neighbors need to do something to help the country become what we say we are.
Amen.
And to stop this kind of thing.
Well, and it was Eugene, Oregon 30 years ago that really kind of pioneered in many ways reimagining public safety in this modern era and the kind of around the era, if you will, of Rodney King and the beginning of us having to grapple with this on video. And that matters because it's part of the conversation right now. You have a chance in your town to be a model. Big cities aren't going to make big changes until they start seeing those changes work in multiple places. There's multiple data points on the chart, and you have the opportunity to make your community, put it on the leading edge, like Eugene put itself on the leading edge 30 years ago. But now we've got to get more and more and more cities follow what Ithaca is doing, to grapple with things the way they are in Minneapolis, to be courageous as they have been in Camden, and your town. And I'm somebody from a small town too, and even smaller than Cervantes, small city. I got to remember that euphemism. Your small town has the opportunity to lead, and as Mary Frances said, to help make our country better.
I think we have time for one more question, and then I'll turn it over to Ben to wrap us up. So the last question we have is, how do you keep the energy up when we're constantly bombarded by more murders by police officers? And, this has been something before the verdict came down. We saw another incident several days before that. During the trial, we saw an incident before that. So how do we deal with that? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
I think I don't have magic. I wish I did. I get tired sometimes. I know friends of mine get tired sometimes. I think the most important thing we can do is recognize that we are all part of a larger stitched community together. And how do I take the baton when you need to rest? And how do you let me rest when you can take the baton? And my biggest worry is after this election and people feel like Donald Trump is no longer an imminent threat, and they're feeling some sense of relief and they don't want to go out and show up anymore. And then it leaves it to the rest of us that are still dealing with these crises in our communities to do this work. The biggest ask I have of anybody is don't give up on us, on the collective experiment of creating a society that works for all of us, that protects all of us. And recognizing that connection, but also recognizing for yourself, it's okay to rest today. It's okay to rest tomorrow. Get yourself ready to keep going at a certain point, but I won't give any false notions that it's not sometimes exhausting. But that's why we try to lean on each other. We support one another. And where you feel you have the energy, you go out and you show up for that person that just can't today.
You have, to that question, I have been in these fights for my whole life. And I'm now 83. And I'm still fighting. And I published a book, I'm a historian, I'm a lawyer too, called History Teaches Us to Resist. And it's how we have made progress by resisting. And protest is an essential ingredient of politics. I say that all the time, and it's true. And I've been in movements where the person next to me got killed, like the Vietnam War protests. I've been in movements in the civil rights movement where the jails were filled with people, including my little brother, and we didn't know where he was. But you just have to keep on working. So you ask, how do you keep your energy up? Sure, rest if you need to. But persistence is the greatest value of any movement. If you cannot be persistent, and if you flag and you don't just keep going, and you cannot let people, politics is important and voting and all that, and we all should do it. But you cannot let people make you believe that if you just vote and go sit down, everything will be fine, because it won't. Voting is part of the equation. It's not the whole equation. So my answer to you is just keep on going, because every generation has to make its own dent in the wall of injustice. And that's what we have to have.
And Mary Frances, you are such a bold reminder that being in the fight, being in the struggle keeps you sharp, keeps you powerful, and keeps you beautiful.
Oh, thank you, darling.
I had no idea you were 83. That is the most impressive thing I've heard in a long time.
All right, thank you.
And I think each of us should take heart in that. You know, one of the privilege of my life has been, learning from people like Joseph Lowry, like Andy Young, like Mary Frances Berry, like Norman Lear, who's about to turn 99, like Dolores Huerta, who just turned 90, and who've stayed in the fight their entire lives. My grandmother, who's 104 and the granddaughter of slaves and trained a social worker named Barbara Mikulski. And so, like, let's not weary in well-doing, because if anything, it's it's a privilege to be in this fight. Now, a lot of us are motivated by the opportunity to make great change, and that's why we're asking you to sign up at pfaw.org/public safety. We're asking you to be active with Move On, be active with People For, because it's organized people who really change the world, and we have three big opportunities to make change. One is at the federal level, and we all know that's going to require getting rid of the filibuster, and we're focused on that. We can get the George Floyd bill through. As Mary Frances said, it is a good start. It is not everything, but it's something that needs to be passed. At the state level, well, we got about a third of the states that are captured by the far right. A lot of us have reason to be concerned that we won't pass it now, but you still got to push, because you may pass it next time. Certainly how the right wing approaches change. They, on voter ID, failed for 10 years before they started succeeding. We have to be willing to keep failing until we win. At the local level, though, again, the beautiful thing is that the jurisdictions where the most Americans live, the cities, the big suburbs, tend to be controlled by progressives. And law enforcement, as President Obama would remind us, is primarily a local issue. And so we have the opportunity to really transform public safety. No matter what the federal government does, no matter what the state's willing to do, we can transform public safety in Jackson, Mississippi. And if you can do it in Jackson, well, you can do it anywhere in this country. And so that's the opportunity that's in front of us right now, why it's so important that each of us stay involved, get involved, and also, quite frankly, get involved with the optimism that 400 years of white supremacy and authoritarianism as the operating system for the worst of American policing is coming to an end. And that we get to be the generations that band together to end it and to really give birth to a democracy that reflects all of our hopes and dreams for our children, and frankly, all of the hopes and dreams of the men who were shot down at the Boston Massacre as well. And I went back the other day and reflected on John Adams' defense of the Redcoats. And he maligned the American revolutionaries that would later make him president, protesting in Boston police abuse, killed by the police that were the Redcoats because they were black and because they were poor whites. And so that's, I think, the beauty of the family here at People For, is that we're a great band of allies that call people together across generations, across racial lines, across class lines and lines of culture and every other line, simply to make our nation stronger. And today we're inviting you to be the first to help us build an army of people in cities across this country, in towns across this country, small towns and small cities like Ithaca, to really build the movement that brings change from the bottom up. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this call. Thank you, Ronna. Thank you, Mary Frances. Thank you, Savante. I'll turn it back over to you, Diallo.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone, all of the PFAS supporters, everyone that's joined us on the Facebook Live. I thank all of our panelists for participating. I think there was a rich and very important conversation about how we move forward, not just recapping, but telling everyone what we can do next and how we actually win this fight. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Please make sure you go online, pfaw.org/public safety, and join us in this fight. Make your voices heard, participate however you can, share it with your friends and family, and we'll continue to be a part of this conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
God bless.